Hi everyone, so today we're putting our finished cover together. So I've just got some pins, a tape measure, I've got a ruler with a steel edge, I've got some thread that I'm going to use all the way around the cover, and this is Anchor 254. It's a lovely lime green that I think looks really striking against the blue. So I like to label my pegs when I decant my skeins onto pegs. It's quite a nice way of storing them. And I write the name on the end just in case I need to replace the colour or anything like that. So I've got that handy. I've got my embroidery scissors and I've got a white heat erased pen so that I can mark my navy blue felt. So if you've been following along our 12 days of Stitchmas, you should have your complete front cover. Now I've taken it a little stage further and put a backing on. So we've put on all our letters, we've appliqued them all on following the themes of the month. I've still got my raw edge there. I've cut a piece that is the size of my page, so we measured it to be 20 centimetres across, including the tabs, and I think it was 18.5 deep. So I've cut a piece of felt to that size and I've stitched it on to the back of that front cover that we've made just to cover the back of the stitches. I've made a little pocket. That side is open. We are going to close it up in the process of making our cover. So I've left on the rest of the cover to wrap around the front. Now you could put a little bit of grey board in there. I just wanted a double layer of felt because I thought that the single layer of felt was a bit thin. You could put the whole length on, but felt has a thickness. This is 1mm thick, the felt that we use and use in our kits. And so what happens is if you put on your inner cover in one long piece, when your book folds around, the outside of the cover is travelling further than the inside, and so the felt wants to move at different rates, and so you get quite a lot of puckering. So I've done it in several sections. It's also going to help me build my spine, which is where we're going to start. So I've just used a simple blanket stitch in my green thread there, and I've done the corners with my little triangle thing. It's left a little bit of a point there sticking out the threads. That's because of the second layer. You can round that off if you want to, but I'm just going to leave it. And so we're all ready to go with the next stage. So the first thing I'm going to do is make my spine, and this is the laced edge that we've been making as we've been going along. I'm just going to put my cover to one side for a moment, and we need to take a measurement of our spine. Now I don't want to just measure the depth of that laced section because I've got to take into account the thickness of the book. There's quite a lot of bulk, and although the spine has pulled around a little bit, the body of the book is much wider. So I want to take that into account, and I'm going to do that by holding the book in a particular way. So you can see there that I've put my knuckles of each hand against the felt at the front and the back, and I'm sort of resting my middle and fourth fingers on the felt, and what I want to measure is from finger to finger rather than from back page to front page. So I'm taking my measurement there. You can see I've got 0 against that finger on the left, and if I go to the finger on the right there, that works out at 6 centimetres. So that's the depth of spine that I'm going to use. So I've cut a piece of felt so that is 6 centimetres wide, and we know that our book is 18.5 centimetres deep. So that's the piece of felt that I'm going to use. Now I'm not gonna lie, this bit can be a little bit fiddly, and you might want to borrow a second pair of hands if you can. So I've marked on my lines for my spine. So what I want to do is line up that piece of felt along the spine so that there's an even overhang on every side. I just want to get it fairly centred. I'm eyeballing it a little bit, and I've got some pins handy. These are quite long pins. I'm sorry I'm so low down on the screen there. I do move it up eventually. So I've lined up my felt. Felt has the benefit of being slightly sticky, so it sticks to itself, and that means that you can put it somewhere and leave it. And I want to just open up my page and hook my pin around that lacing inside the cover. So it's a little bit tricky. You might have to do it more than once to get everything lined up. So I've started at one end, I've gone to the centre, and I'm using my left hand there to just push in the spine and make sure it's tight up against the book. And then I've got my pin at the bottom there, and I'm just going to check to make sure that's straight and square on and lined up. Then I'm going to flip my book over and do the same on the back. Now I'm going to have to lift up the page a little bit now, because I don't want the overhang at the back to be really massive. I want it to be similar to the overhang at the front. So I'm going to start at the ends. You can see the overhang there is absolutely massive at the moment. What I'm going to do is start at the ends, and I'm going to lift up that front page and hold it in place while I pin along the spine. So I'm just it's actually the back page, isn't it? I'm going to lift up that back page, hold it in place while I put a pin into the spine, and then I'm going to go down. I'm just checking that it's right. I'm going to go down to the other end. I'm not going to do the middle one yet. I'm going to go down to the other end, line that piece of felt up, lift up that back page, and then pin through. And now that's in place, I can work on the centre. And the centre I'm going to have to lift up quite a lot, because a lot of the bulk of the pages is towards the top and bottom, and so that middle page sinks down. The middle of the page sinks down a lot. So I'm just now checking it to make sure it's even all the way around. I just need to readjust a little bit here and there, and it's worth taking some time to get this right, because it will make your book sit very strangely if it's lumpy and bumpy at this stage. So I'm just adjusting there. Now you might be able to see there is a little bit of a lump in the spine there. That is simply because the pages are bulkier at the bottom than at the top. That will correct itself as we work through, so make sure that when you pin it, it's correct. When you let go, it might fall in a funny way, but it will correct itself as long as you've pinned it straight. So you can see my overhangs are all level there. Now I've got a length of my green thread. I've got 2 strands here, and what I want to do is backstitch the lacing to the spine. So I'm going to bring my needle up from the back in between those pages, and I'm going to take my needle over the top of my lacing and then backstitch down to the next lace stitch. So I'm always stitching over the lacing to hold it in place, and this just takes a little bit of manoeuvring. You might want to use your non-dominant hand to push your needle through from the back, just like I'm doing there. A longer needle would be better for this, because you've got more room to sort of pivot it and hook the felt in. I tend to use quite long needles anyway, just because of my grip. So I'm just being careful there to catch in my lacing stitches, and that's going to hold the lacing at a particular place on the spine. So this is where we're going to start correcting that lumpiness, because we're going to make our book sit where we want it to. The benefit of fabric is that you can manipulate it and move it to do exactly what you want it to do, and so that's what we're doing here. So it's going to take a little while to get those stitches in, but it's really worth taking some time over this. We've spent a year making a beautiful book of textile art and embroidery, and we don't want the final look of the book to spoil all that hard work that we've done. So if I flip it onto the end, you can just see it's normal. It's just the normal back of back stitch there, and it's a relatively straight line, so just trust the process because it will work. So I'm just going to stitch all the way to the end there. If you're not sure about the lacing technique that we've used to make this book, I will link the video where I explain it at the top of the screen there. So now I can take my pins out, and I'm just going to finish my thread on the back of the spine. This isn't going to show because it's going to be against the outer cover. So that's my first line of stitching in place. Now I'm going to open to the front page, and I'm going to do exactly the same process down there. So now I've got my front and back page in, and you can see that lump a lot more clearly now. It will work though, I promise you. So fortunately I know how this video ends. So now I'm going to find roughly the centre. I've got 8 pages in this book, but actually because of the depth of some of the pages, the centre isn't at page 4. So I'm going to find the centre and fold my book back so that the spine folds with it, and that will help me to get my stitches in the right place. We're just going to add in another few lines of stitches. So as it turns out, I've gone in 3 pages from the back, and that's seems like a sensible place to put my next row of stitching in. So I'm going to repeat the process again, making my lacing sit on the spine where I want it to sit, and it will sort of lift the pages away from each other a little bit so that your book sits more squarely. So I'm just going to stitch down that part of the spine. There are loads of different ways of making a book. This is just a way that I've found that has worked for this book. Works particularly well if your pages are different depths. So I've gone 3 pages from the back. It seems sensible to go 3 pages from the front and just put another line of stitching down there. So I'm just going to add in another line of stitch just in between those 2 lines there, and just repeat the process again so that our spine is attached nice and securely. So that's the final line in there, and now we've got our spine piece really securely attached. You can see that the lump has corrected itself already. So I've got my overhang there, that's going to help the cover sit correctly. And so now we need to attach this to our outer cover. So I'm just going to bring that back in. And we need to do a little bit of measuring first. I've got to take into account the depth of the felt. So I've found where my inner front cover ends, and I've measured 2mm out from that to take into account the 2 layers of felt. And I've put a little line down there marking that 2mm mark, so that's the white line that you can see. This is going to be made out of 3 pieces that are going to work together without bunching up. You can see if I roll the cover there, it wants to bunch because of the thickness of the felt. So I've just got 2mm there, and I've marked the line, and I want to mark my spine width. So now I'm going to look at marking 6 centimetres across from that first white line, and then I want to add another 2mm to position my back cover. So I've got that tram line there on the right, and these are my guidelines to attach my spine. So I'm just going to sit the spine onto the cover, and again it's worth taking some time to get this right. I'm just going to line up the edge of my spine piece that I've just sewn onto my book with that first white line on my cover piece, and I'm going to put a pin in at the bottom. I'm going to use an extra pin as we're going along here because I just want everything to line up. Now I'm going to go straight to the other end because we want to ease this to be flat. So if you just work along in a line, what you might end up doing is pushing the spine to the right, and the spine won't line up with the cover piece. So I'm making sure my ends are correct, and then I'm going to put 2 pins in the middle, always making sure the spine piece, the edge of the spine piece, is lined up to that white line. Like that. So that's nice and secure. Now I can flip to the back, and I'm going to repeat that process, and I want to make sure I'm lining up with that first white line. So I want to be able to see the tram line because otherwise my spine isn't going to sit correctly. So it's the first of the 2 lines that we drew, and I'm just going to pin that in and line it all up again. Now my spine piece is secure and it's lined up and sitting flat against the cover piece. So I've got my thread again, and the first thing I'm going to do is blanket stitch along the top. And so I'm going to take my thread in, I've tucked it under the inside of the front cover, and I'm bringing the thread up just inside that last stitch, and we're going to create a seamless join. So my first stitch is going to be just onto the inner of the front cover, and then I'm going to get a stitch in the gap, so that's the tram lines between the front inner cover and the spine piece. Just adjusting it there to make sure it's square and the weight of the book isn't pulling it out of shape. And then my next stitch is going to take me onto the spine piece, and this is where we start securing that piece in place. So I'm just going to blanket stitch across. I will link a tutorial for blanket stitch if you're not sure at the top of the screen. So I'm just going to finish at the edge of my spine piece, and I'm going to finish off that thread by stitching through my last stitch and pulling it tight, and then we hide our end by taking our needle through the felt some distance away, and we pull on that thread end, push down with our scissors, and when we snip, the end disappears back inside the felt. So that's nice and secure at the top. And I'm going to do the bottom edge, and then we'll come back and put some lines down the spine. So I've got my top and bottom edge, and you can probably see the ghost of some lines that I marked in. I did mark them and then decided that they were too faint, so I've just lightened them up a little bit so that I can not be distracted by them. And what we want to do is make that spine more secure. It's quite baggy at the moment, and if we add some stitching, it's going to reinforce that spine and make it sit squarely and behave really nicely. So I'm going to find my beginning and end of the spine piece. So I can see where that piece begins and ends. And I'm just going to mark the centre. So I want to mark at 3 centimetres just because that's halfway along that spine piece. So I'm going to do the same at the top. So I'm lining my ruler up with the edge of the inner spine piece. That's what I'm measuring from. It's hard to see because of the angle. So I'm just going to put in that line as a guide. You don't have to measure, you can do it by eye, but I like things to look straight. So So now I'm going to take my thread up just from the inside of the cover there onto the spine, and this is a little bit fiddly because you can't really stitch this by doing a hooking motion. You've got to do each stitch in 2 motions. So I'm going straight down through both layers of the spine, and I'm bringing my needle out in between my pages there on the lacing, and I'm just going to do a running stitch. So I'm coming back up in between the pages to the outside of the cover, and then I go back down. I'm just going to running stitch all the way along that line, and that's going to stitch the outer and inner spine pieces together, but it's also going to make that spine much more robust as well. Felt has a peculiar quality that when you embroider into it, it makes it more rigid. We saw that when we did our butterfly back in July. You can manipulate the felt once it's got embroidery in it. It sort of almost creates like boning in the felt. So any embroidery or stitching we add is going to help this felt be more rigid and robust. So when I'm all the way to the end, I'm just going to make a tiny quilter's knot just on the inside of the cover there, and I'm going to take my needle through the felt, bring it out a distance away and trim it off, and that hides the end and just leaves us with quite a neat little knot on the surface there that's barely noticeable. Now you could leave it at that, just with one line, but I want to add some more lines of stitching, partly because I want to stitch down this open edge on the inside of my front cover. So I'm going to measure so that that first line of stitching holds that in place. That's all my stitching in, and you can see it's sitting much more squarely. That front cover piece is nice and secure now. You can barely see the stitching. If you used a dark blue or used a matching colour, you wouldn't see the stitching at all. So now we want to add our inner back cover, and I've got my tram line on there ready to mark it. I've cut my piece of felt that's the right size, so that's 20 centimetres wide, 18.5 deep, and once again I'm going to line up that piece with the second of the 2 white lines there. So I'm doing the corner and then going along to make sure the bottom edge is square on, and then repeating that with the top. And I'm just going to blanket stitch again. Now I'm going to start off by drawing a line that I can stitch along, so I'm going to add another line of running stitch that's going to secure that back cover to the outer cover, and so we don't have a pocket again. So that's my last line of running stitch that I'm going to put in first. That's going to hold my inner back cover in place while I'm doing my blanket stitch edge. So I'm just adding the running stitch here in just in the same way. It's a bit easier because I'm not working through pages. I do have that great long flap of felt though to work around. So that's all the stitching along my spine there. That's going to just keep everything nice and secure and neat on the inside. And so now I'm going to do my blanket stitch. So just like before, I've just got an end there that has escaped. Just like before, I'm going to come up inside that stitch. I'm going to stitch that thread end into place. So I'm just going to line it up along the edge and stitch over it, and you'll barely notice it when I've done that. So I'm just trying to work out how to get my angle right to stitch this. It's quite cumbersome, but again, definitely worth taking some time over to get the finish right. So I'm just going to stitch along the top and bottom edge. I'm leaving the right the open edge down the height of the book open at the moment until we're ready. So that back piece is stitched on, and now we're going to work on this flap section. So you can organise it so that it's nice and tight. You could just have your book open, but I want a closure, so if you want it open, you just trim off the felt at the edge of the back cover and blanket stitch down the edge, and that's done. But I wanted a flap, so I could fold it so that it's quite tight, but I want to make it so that it's square, so it's almost like a box around the book. So what I'm going to do is measure another 6 centimetres to make the sort of right hand spine. The first thing I'm going to do is mark my 2mm line away from the inner back cover. That's going to stop my felt puckering, and we know that our spine is 6 centimetres, so I'm going to measure 6 centimetres and put a line there. Now I want to account for the overhang, so I'm going to mark another 2mm line to account for the depth of the felt. And so now I just need to decide what sort of overhang I need, and I think I decided on 8 centimetres, and that will give enough of a flap to keep the book secure and look like a wrap rather than an accident, and it will give me some space to add a button as well. So I've just got to get my cutting mat in, because I'm going to cut that felt now. I've measured all the overhang that I need, and you can do this with scissors. I like a rotary cutter, it just gives a really nice edge. That's about 14.4, I think it is, 14 and a bit centimetres. So I've just cut a piece of felt to fit neatly in the space that's remaining, and I'm just going to pin that in place. Now I want to match my right hand spine to my left hand spine, so I'm just marking where that piece begins, and I'm going to measure 6 centimetres again on the outside and just draw some lines along that right hand spine, and I'm going to running stitch them just like I have on the first spine so that the sides of the book match. So that's going to hold down the end of that, the edge of that piece, and I'm just marking in my lines to stitch along, and I'm just going to running stitch those just the same way as I did with the other edge. So I'm tucking the knot inside in between the two layers. I'm doing this first so that I can hide my thread ends, and it's just a matter of running stitching the two pieces together. So again, you've got to be careful to work through both layers of felt. Because we're not negotiating the book pages, we can hook it this time, so it's a lot quicker. That's all my spine lines in place, and now I just need to blanket stitch around the edge. So I'm tucking that knot inside again, and I'm just going to blanket stitch all the way around that remaining piece, just to finish the edges off really neatly and make the book look really nice. So that's it, all stitched. Really pleased with the way that's looking. It's looking really neat, and I can square off the end there. So all I need to do now is make a closure for my book, and I'm just lining it up so that the edge of my front cover lines up with the first line of stitching on that right hand spine. Just want to make sure the book is nice and square and everything's straight, and I'm just going to pin it in place while I work out where to place my button. So I'm going to make a buttonhole and add a button on. Now I'm tilting my book so that I've got some space to work with, so it's a bit flatter there at the spine, and I've got a nice lime green button that I think looks really cute and is a good colour match and just about the right size. I don't want a giant button because it's just going to be cumbersome, so I'm just going to measure how far I want that in from the edge, and I'm just going to, this is a quilting ruler so I can use the grid lines on it to measure. I think I did 3.5 centimetres in the end, so I'm just going to make a little mark to show whereabouts the button should be, and I want to measure halfway down the book page. So it's 18.5 centimetres deep, so I need that to be at 9.25. So where those lines cross over each other, that is where my button's going to be. So this is a 2 centimetre button, I believe. And so I'm going to measure 1 centimetre either side of that centre mark, and that's going to be the length of my buttonhole. So I'm going to measure now 0.5 centimetre either side of that vertical centre line, and that's going to guide my blanket stitch that I'm going to use around the buttonhole. So I've roughly marked on an opening for my button there. So the first thing I'm going to do is running stitch around it, because I want to hold together the 2 layers of felt around that buttonhole. So I'm going to try and ease that knot through in between the 2 layers of felt. If you can't do it, don't worry, because it's going to be stitched over, so it's not a problem. And I want to make my stitches quite small and relatively close together. I'm just making a little box there in running stitch all the way around. That's just going to reinforce my felt. Then I'm going to bring my needle up just on the line there. So I want to finish off my thread there. I'm not going to detach it though, because I'm going to carry on stitching with it, and I just want to cut the 2 layers of felt. Now this is tricky because you have got 2 layers. A seam ripper would have been a much better strategy, and I discovered in doing this that I needed to sharpen my scissors because the tip wasn't as sharp as I needed it to be. So you might see my scissors change in a moment, but I'm just going to cut along that opening. Don't know why I didn't turn the book round there. Just got into a really peculiar position with my arm. Didn't do myself any favours. So I think I've got through both layers, and I'm just checking that my button will go through the hole. I want it to be fairly tight because as I stitch it, that hole is going to get slightly bigger. So I don't want the buttonhole too big at this stage. So now what I'm going to do is blanket stitch around that hole, and I'm working through the hole. So we're just going to bind the edge of this buttonhole. This is not going to be the neatest buttonhole you'll ever see, but it more than does the job. So I'm just making my blanket stitches really close together, and the horizontals of the stitch form the binding around the hole that I've just cut. So I'm taking my needle down and bringing it back up through the buttonhole, and I'm using those guidelines that I drew to keep my stitches an even depth, evenish, and I just work all the way around there to form my buttonhole. Now you can go around again and fill in all the gaps, but I quite liked the sketchiness of it. So you can see there, it's almost outlined in the green thread, and that binds the buttonhole and stops the felt from tearing or keeps the buttonhole the same size. So now I'm just going to line up my front and back covers again, because I'm going to mark where my button needs to go. I'm just poking my pen through the buttonhole there to make a mark on the inside of the felt. So that's the positioning of my button. And so all I need to do now is stitch it on. I should have made sure it was going to be halfway by measuring it, but I just forgot what I was doing. So I'm putting in a few stitches to secure the thread, and then I'm going to just stitch in the button. It's a bit overkill, the number of stitches I put in, but I just don't want it to fall off. I'm tying off my thread there, and that is my cover finish. So now I can close my book with my button, and that's my completed Winging It book. It's been an absolute blast making this book with you. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I'm so chuffed with the way it looks. I think the cover works really nicely, and it's going to protect all of that stitching that we've done through the year. I just think it's a great record of all our work and a lovely memento of the year 2022. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through 2022. I would love to see your books, so please do post your finished books at #FSHWingingIt, and I hope that you're going to join me in 2023 for our quilt adventure. So happy crafting, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.